All right. Good evening. Hello, everyone. And we got 3 articles to get through tonight. 2 of them are pretty short, so it shouldn't be too much longer than normal stream. The first 2 are on Newton. And it's actually not. It's about normal length. The second one is on Newton. 2, 3. And then we have one on Gurdjieff. I was wrong. One's only a page shorter than normal. The other 2 are normal length. So that's all right. We're going to get through all 3 of them because that finishes up this section tonight. And we can get into the final section, the spirit and the soul, which should prove to be interesting. All right, here we go. Jumping right into it. Article 31, Newton, Alchemy, and the Rise of the British Empire. The Mystical Foundation of Empirical Science by Peter Bross. I'm assuming that's Bross, B-R-O-S. Bross, or because it's not Bros. I'm sure it could be Bros, I guess, but Bross seems more correct. Anyway, casual observers locate the origin of the British Empire in Elizabethan England because the period appears to have wealth and military glory, the twin marks of empire. Elizabethan glory, however, was short-lived. The wealth came from privateers, the Sir Francis Drakes who raided gold-carrying Spanish galleons, and victory over the vengeful Spanish Armada in 1588 resulted as much from England's weather as from her military genius. The gold was quickly depleted by Elizabeth's successor, James I, who, resorting to merciless taxation to maintain the crown's splendor, set the stage for a revolt that took the head of his son, Charles I. Charles II, wary of following in his father's footsteps, borrowed money from the goldsmiths, the bankers of the day, to support his indulgences, but he soon defaulted. William of Orange landed in 1688 to claim the throne on behalf of his wife, Mary, the daughter of the deposed James II, Charles's younger brother. Parliament restricted the crown's taxing power, leaving William without funds to defend England against James, who had aligned himself with the Catholic France. These events did not augur empire. William needed money to defend his crown. He couldn't raise money by taxation, and the crown's credit was non-existent. William's only hope lay in persuading the English Parliament to adopt a banking system similar to that of his native Netherlands, a fading empire that had inherited the mantle of reserve banking from Venice. Reserve banking is the practice of making loans in multiples of the gold deposits on hand in the hope that depositors won't make a run on the bank, all claiming their deposits at the same time. William Paterson, a Scot, studied reserve banking and worked up an ingenious proposal for an English reserve bank. Noting that currency circulates as an integral part of commerce, Paterson reasoned that the panic resulting from the loss of confidence that drove depositors to demand their gold would not infect currency holders. He proposed creating a bank that would lend money to the crown in exchange for a note. The crown's note would then be used to back paper currency that the bank would lend into existence. In effect, the crown would receive the value of all monies the bank lent into existence, with the bank receiving interest from both the crown and the loans created by its currency issue. The currency holders would not run the bank because the currency would be in perpetual circulation. The English goldsmiths accepted gold deposits, earning money on the differences between what they paid for the gold and what they could get by lending it to borrowers. The proposed bank would compete with their operations and, if given the power to deal in gold on behalf of the crown, eliminate their profession altogether. The goldsmiths were understandably opposed to financing William's wars with debt-created currency. By allying with the Tories who controlled Parliament, they presented a formidable obstacle to the bank's establishment. And before I go on, there is a picture. Epicenter of the British Empire, Parliament House, London, engraving by Thomas Hosmer Shepherd. Go. The survival of William's sovereignty, therefore, depended on a formidable task, the implementation of Paterson's proposed Bank of England over the active opposition of Parliament and the existing banking establishment. Charles Montague, a member of William's landing party, tackled the task. Montague had, while attending Cambridge in the 1680s, befriended Isaac Newton, eventually taking Newton's niece as his lover. Newton, the second Lucasian professor of mathematics, had made a minor stir before the new Royal Society with an ingenious optical invention, the reflecting telescope. His proposal that white light was made up of all colors of the spectrum was met with skepticism by society members, but in 1684 a discussion of gravity by members Edmund Halley, Christopher Wren, and Robert Hooke led to Newton's ideas forming the foundation upon which all scientific thought rests. The discussion involved Kepler's recently published laws, specifically that a planet sweeps out equal areas in equal times as it travels around the sun. Hooke wondered if that law, the product of the square of the distance of a planet from the sun, might be correlated to Galileo's discovery that objects accelerate with the square of the distance over which they fall. If the two could be mathematically related, Hooke reasoned the same gravity that made objects fall could be seen as affecting the orbits of the planets, demonstrating that gravity was a property of the matter making up the planets. The three decided to offer a modest prize on behalf of the Royal Society to anyone who could mathematically show a relationship between a planet's motion and the rate an object fell. Halley related the offer to Newton the next time he visited Cambridge. Notoriously cold, arrogant, and intolerant of criticism, Newton said that he had already demonstrated that relationship by applying his recently invented calculus to the orbit of the moon. Newton's calculations, however, didn't work. He had characteristically jumped the gun, and although his equations never did successfully balance, by hectoring Halley for more favorable measurements of the moon's orbit, he was able, by 1687, to express the gist of his ideas in the Principia, a treatise he was obliged to revise for the rest of his life. Montague was interested in Newton's attempts to demonstrate that gravity was a property of matter, but his reasons were unrelated to the motion of the moon. He was interested in Newton for his practice of alchemy. Alchemy was the physics of the time and generated the same fascination as stories of atom smashing do today. The public held claims of alchemical accomplishments like current claims of quarks and wormholes in awe. Alchemy involved mixing three substances, an impure metal, such as iron, or a pure metal, such as lead or mercury, and an organic acid together in a mortar. The mixture could take months. The finished compound was slowly heated in a crucible and then dissolved in an acid under polarized light, the source of Newton's interest in optics and the spectrum. The solvent was evaporated in a process that took years, its completion signaled by an occult sign known only to the initiated. The distillate was oxidized using potassium nitrate, producing a rough form of gunpowder. To practice alchemy was a crime punishable by death, and the danger of explosion limited the number of alchemists who reached its final stages. Those who survived hermetically sealed the distillate in a special container, the sealing stage giving rise to the practice of referring to the body of ancient alchemical knowledge as the Hermetic tradition. The sealed container was heated and then cooled when cooled, reportedly produced a powder known as the white stone. The white stone could be used to transmute base metals into silver, allowing alchemists to stock their pantry with silverware made from iron. Applying their knowledge of the hidden secrets of the universe, alchemists could then distill the white stone into the philosopher's stone, which could transmute base metals into pure gold. Charles Montague was interested in the philosopher's stone because of its reputed power to turn base metals into gold. He knew that the success of a reserve bank depended on its ability to withstand a run on its assets. He was aware that the ability to withstand a run would depend on the confidence of the bank's depositors had that their deposits were safe. He understood that this confidence in the safety of the bank's deposits depended solely on perception, that depositors would not run a bank if their deposits appeared safe. Montague set out to exploit the widespread public belief in alchemy and its claim that the philosopher's stone could turn base metals into gold to establish the Bank of England, whose paper currency, purportedly representing an equal amount of silver on deposit, would be backed by nothing. He wanted Newton close in case his alchemical reputation was needed to give the bank the appearance of having unlimited supplies of silver to back its paper currency. Montague didn't care whether Newton could turn these base metals into gold and silver as long as the public believed he could. The first step in making the public believe that Newton was in fact capable of such a feat was to promote Newton's universal gravitation as the discovery of the heretofore hidden secrets of the universe, the secrets the alchemist needed to produce the philosopher's stone. Montague became the president of the Royal Society and used its influence to promote the Principia, with Newton's ideas of universal gravitation becoming uh, drawing room talk throughout London. Montague also tackled Tory control of Parliament, successfully unseating the Tories in favour of William's Whigs in 1694. Montague immediately tacked a provision onto the annual Ways and Means Bill securing legislative authorization for the Bank of England. The bank was organised with a loan of £1.2 million to William, equal to £120 million, nearly 220 million US at today's values. William returned a note to the bank, which then lent pound sterling notes into public circulation. The goldsmiths, however, countered with a provision in the Recoinage Act requiring that old coins be surrendered for their face value rather than for the value of the silver remaining after clipping. England had introduced the milled coins invented by Pierre Blondeau in 1662, but failed to make any provision for retiring clipped coins. The legislation that created the Bank of England empowered it to handle bullion transactions for England. Because the bank was now responsible for recoinage, it would be forced to pay for retiring all England's debased coinage at face value. The recoinage was ordered to take effect February 1st, 1697. In the summer of 1695, Montague discovered that the goldsmiths were collecting clipped coins and cashing them in for their full value in the pound sterling notes the bank had been issuing. He realized that when the goldsmiths controlled enough of the pound sterling notes, they would demand their full value in silver, causing a public panic and a general rush on the bank to redeem all of its paper notes for silver the bank didn't have. Montague immediately started rumors that Newton would be made master of the mint in charge of the recoinage, with the master alchemist, the man who had demonstrated intimate knowledge of the secrets of the universe, serving as master of the mint. The bank would give the appearance of holding unlimited amounts of silver bullion. The appearance of unlimited wealth would eliminate the public's fear of collapse and stop a run on the bank's assets. Montague, however, discovered that Thomas Neal, installed a master of the mint for life, had no intention of giving up his job. The remainder of 1695 turned into a horse race. Would Montague be able to install Newton at the mint before the goldsmiths ran the bank? Montague gave up trying to install Newton as master, instead moving the warden of the mint to customs and installing Newton as the new warden on March 19th, 1696, not a moment too soon. The goldsmiths, having amassed £30,000, more than 500,000 US in today's currency, in paper notes, made their run on the bank the week of May 4th. Sir John Houblon was the Lord Mayor of London, a large stockholder in the bank, and the bank's governor. In 1994, the Bank of England honoured Houblon by placing his likeness on the £50 note. Questions circulated about why the bank would choose a total unknown to honour its 300th anniversary. It did so because Sir John was the official who, on that May morning in 1696, met the angry mobs demanding their paper pound notes be traded for silver. History doesn't record what Sir John told the angry mob on the steps of the bank that day, but we can assume it had something to do with the new man at the mint the mint whose genius put the philosopher's stone at the beck and call of the bank. For what else would have sent the angry crowds home, never again to question the liquidity of the Bank of England? England's enemies would never again question her ability to finance wars on the world stage. The bank's reputed possession of the Philosopher's Stone became irrelevant as the world came to realize that reserve banking is the money machine that buys empire. Adopting a flexible reserve banking system on the eve of the First World War, the United States used the Federal Reserve System to finance the Second World War, the most expensive and arguably the most successful war in history. Newton took over as Master of the Bank of England when Neil finally died several years after the run on the bank. His new job gave him the power of life and death over counterfeiters. Prosecuting his duties with vigor, Newton enjoyed disguising himself in rough garb to carouse sordid bars in search of counterfeiters. With armed men close by, hapless rogues attempting to pass counterfeit coins were arrested. With Newton as the sole judge and jury, these men were slowly drawn and quartered, a practice Newton indulged in for the rest of his life. Montague maintained control of the moribund Royal Society until the succession of Queen Anne temporarily dimmed his political fortunes. Together with his hand-picked successor, Lord Somers, he chaired only 4 society meetings in 8 years. Newton stepped in and had himself elected president in 1703, filling the post until his death a quarter of a century later. During the intervening wars, he elevated the society to the position of arbiter of what was and was not science. Just as Montague had promoted Newton's theory of universal gravitation to give the Bank of England the appearance of infallibility, Newton promoted the Royal Society as the sole source of all knowledge in order to give British science the appearance of infallibility. Along the way, Newton institutionalized his own ideas as central to British science. When it came to practical applications, however, Newton's infallibility fell in the face of reality. His claim to calculus, the subject of a bitter battle with Leibniz over precedence during Newton's lifetime, was settled by practice in favor of Leibniz, whose notation is now universally used. With regard to the realm of ideas, though, Newton's infallibility remains unchallenged. Hooke, who went to his deathbed claiming precedence for the ideas in Newton's Principia, was figuratively drawn and quartered by the band of intellectual sycophants with whom Newton stalked the Royal Society. Newton actually displayed a ceremonial mace on the table in front of him at Royal Society meetings to underscore his authority. The implications of a counterfeit coin surreptitiously slipped into one's waistcoat wouldn't be lost on potential dissenters. Newton, however, succeeded in his proof of universal gravitation. Subsequent attempts by his intellectual heirs had to be abandoned when the orbits of planets were found to present greater discrepancies than existed with Newton's use of the moon's orbit. The failure was left an unproven proposition at the heart of modern science. Instead of abandoning a failed hypothesis, however, science now assumes Newton's universal gravitation as fact. Science then uses this to predict the mass of planets and stars, predictive facts that are not independently verifiable, perpetuating a proposition that has never been and never can be tested. Newton's ideas that white light is made up of all color and that colors are specific wavelengths that emerge from the prism in descending order are propositions like mass/gravity as incapable of proof today as they were in his day. The British Empire Newton helped create collapsed in the 20th century, but Newton's ideas, which Montague promoted as infallible in order to establish the monetary basis of empire, and which Newton viciously perpetuated by bludgeoning all dissent, remain both omnipresent and baseless, the invisible, unquestioned, and ultimately non-existent pillars upon which all scientific thought rests. Wow. Okay. I hadn't heard all that about Newton before. Very interesting. Didn't know who, well, I didn't really know a whole lot about Newton, to be completely honest. I mean, just the very basic stuff about discovering gravity and all that kind of stuff. If that's even the right way of verbalizing that. Um, but, kind of the Washington can't tell a lie and chop down the cherry tree kind of stuff. More myth than really anything of substance. Okay, so moving on to Newton and the Bible, and this is the shorter of the three. No pictures and 5 pages. So here we go. 32. Newton and the Bible. What did the great scientist foresee for the year 2060 by John Chambers. On February 22, 2003, the Daily Telegraph of London, England, published a front-page story that began with the words, Sir Isaac Newton, Britain's greatest scientist, predicted the date of the end of the world, and it is only 57 years away. The Telegraph somewhat softened its horrific first paragraph that Newton had predicted the end of the world for 2060 by declaring in a fourth paragraph, quote, Newton, who was also a theologian and alchemist, predicted that the second coming of Christ would follow plagues and war and would precede 1,000-year reign by the saints on earth, of which he would be one, end quote. But the damage was done. Over the next few days, the news was disseminated to every corner of the globe, getting much play in newspapers, on radio, on TV, and on a vast number of internet news sites, many of which played the story for laughs, showing, for example, a graphic illustration of a mushroom cloud along with the words, Party like it's 2060. Although the 2060 date came as a shock to the general public, which was not even aware of Newton's theological interests, it wasn't news to the small group of scholars who regularly study the theology of Sir Isaac Newton. One of those scholars, Assistant Professor Stephen D. Snobelin of the University of King's College in Halifax, Nova Scotia, had broached it in the course of the Daily Telegraph interview some 9 days prior to the airing on Britain's BBC Two of a documentary, Newton the Dark Heretic. One of the historical consultants for the BBC documentary, Professor Snobelin, is shown in a closing sequence handling and commenting on the manuscript bearing the 2060 date at the Jewish National and University Library in Jerusalem. The explosive date of AD 2060 had been known to Newton scholars since the early 1970s. The scientist's theological and alchemical papers remained out of sight in the house of the Earl of Portsmouth, a descendant of Newton's niece, for 250 years until in 1936 the eccentric Jewish scholar Abraham Shalom Ezekiel Yahuda acquired the largest single collection of the theological papers at an auction at Sotheby's in London. Yehuda bequeathed the documents to the State of Israel, but it wasn't until 1967 that they finally ended up in the Jewish Library in Jerusalem. Even so, they remained difficult to access by scholars until 1991, when the majority of Newton's scientific, administrative, theological, and alchemical manuscripts were released on microfilm. Sir Isaac Newton, 1642 to 1727, was one of the 2 or 3 most influential scientists who ever lived. He discovered the 3 laws of motion, the concepts of mass, force, and universal gravitation, and the true nature of light. In addition, he independently invented, along with Gottfried Leibniz, the differential calculus. However, he was also one of the most thoroughgoing and perspicacious researchers into theology and alchemy that the world has ever known. This renowned mathematician/scientist believed that the Word of God was writ large both in the natural world, he had done much to uncover those words, and in the Bible, and Newton was just as driven to discover the Word in the latter as in the former. Further powering his drive to plumb the depths of the Scriptures and of all other noteworthy classical texts as well was his conviction that the ancients had discovered the same laws of the universe as he had discovered. In setting them forth in the 3 volumes of the Principia Mathematica, he was merely dressing up, in modern garb, truths that the great thinkers of the past had known since the beginning of time, truths that they had called the Principia Sapientia, yeah, pristine wisdom. Newton's announcement unearthed 3 centuries after the publication of the Principia that the world would end, or more accurately, would transition to a very different state. In 2060 was an announcement uniquely destined to arouse passionate interest and anxiety in the year 2003. After all, 2003 was the year the United States invaded Iraq, the land of ancient Babylon, stirring up to no predictable end the international wasp's nest of radical Muslim terrorism. It was the year that North Korea, Pakistan, and India rattled their nuclear sabers. It was a year in which AIDS, a plague of biblical proportions, continued to ravage the world, and when the SARS epidemic leapt out of nowhere, as if to give us all a bitter foretaste of apocalyptic doom to come. To top it off, 2060 was a date dangerously close to 2012, the year when, according to many prophets and prophetic texts, both ancient and modern, mankind will be engulfed in a final, world-convulsing holocaust. A 2002 History Channel documentary on the Bible Code erroneously calls Newton an early investigator into the uncanny, accessible to computers only code popularized by Michael Drosnin in his books The Bible Code and The Bible Code 2, 1997 and 2003. And as a matter of fact, I have one right here. So if anybody's interested in having me read it, I will certainly add that onto the list, and we'll read it. Okay. But Newton didn't believe God's prophetic words were embedded in an eternally dynamic subtext hidden beneath the literal text of the Bible. Deeply religious, the scientist was a member of the Church of England even while he adhered in secret to the belief of the 4th century heretic Arius that the doctrine of the Trinity, that God, the Holy Spirit, and Christ are one, was a diabolical falsehood imposed by the early church. Newton believed that though the Son and the Holy Spirit were divine, only God was God. The scientist had come to this belief through a painstaking study of the Scriptures and of other contemporaneous texts. He believed that the Bible was an expression of the Word of God, but that there were many corrupt and flawed versions of the Bible. Newton had set himself the lifetime task of minutely and rigorously examining the texts to see exactly what God had said. He went about this in the same way as the modern biblical scholar, by rounding up all of the different versions of the particular text that he could get his hands on in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, his chief interest being in the book of Daniel and of Revelation, and subjecting them to a minute comparative linguistic analysis. From this he could determine the true meaning of the words. Newton's interpretations are then hardly fantastical and not even mystical. He steered clear of those prophets like Ezekiel, who seemed to him to speak in wildly emotional terms. For example, his interpretation of the provocative word beast in the book of Revelation, based on careful linguistic analysis, is simply groups of people or organizations, notably the churches. In a forthcoming book, Isaac Newton, Heretic, Professor Snoblin writes that for Newton, the holy prophecies, quote unquote, the holy prophecies of the scriptures were nothing other than, quote unquote, histories of things to come. Yehuda manuscript 1.1, folio 16 recto. Not sure what recto means. RECTO. Um, Crucial to Newton's interpretation of these highly symbolic texts was his belief that the prophetic time periods of 1260, 1290, 1335, and 2300 days actually represent 1260, 1290, 1230, or 1335, and 2300 years, using the day for a year principle. How did Newton come to this strange belief? In a special communication to Atlantis Rising, Professor Snoblin writes, quote, Newton was following in the tradition of Joseph Mede, M-E-D-E, the Cambridge polymath and prophetic exegete who died in 1638, but the day for a year principle is based on other scriptural texts, such as N-U, 1634, or 14, chapter 14, 30, verse 34. I don't know why I've lost that word. But NU, am I forgetting a book in the Bible named NU? New? Or is that an abbreviation that I'm just not picking up on? Anyway, after the number of days in which he searched the land, in the number of, blah, blah, blah. Okay, sorry. This is a quote from that chapter and verse. After the number of days in which ye searched the land, even 40 days each day for a year, shall ye bear your iniquities, even 40 years, and ye shall know my breach of promise. End quote. And Ezekiel, chapter 4, verse 6. So that must be an abbreviation I'm just not picking up on, because this one is obviously Ezekiel, chapter 4, verse 6. Quote, and when thou hast accomplished them, lie again on the right side, and thou shalt bear the iniquity of the house of Judah 40 days. I have appointed thee each day for a year. End quote. And that's the end of the whole quote, not just the quotes within quotes. Professor Snoblin sets out the prophetic time periods in this way. Quote, the time period 1260 days appears in Daniel chapter 7, verse 25 as a time and times and the dividing of time equal to a year, 2 years, and a half year. Daniel chapter 12, verse 7 as a time, times, and half, equal to a year, 2 years, and a half year. Revelation chapter 11, verse 3, 1260 days. Revelation chapter 12, verse 6, 1260 days. And Revelation chapter 13, verse 5, 42 months. The time period 1290 days appears in Daniel chapter 12, verse 11. The time period 1335 days appears in Daniel chapter 12, verse 12. The time period 2300 days occurs in Daniel chapter 8, verse 14. And all of that was another quote. End quote. For Newton, these time periods, especially that of 1260 years, represent the period during which the corrupted church, this being for Newton the Trinitarian Church, chiefly the Catholics, went into the slow decline. That is, the period of its apostasy or abandonment of true beliefs. The problem lay in tracking down the exact date of commencement of the period of apostasy. To this date would be added the figure of 1260 years, thereby arriving at the exact year when the church would finally crumble, bringing in the wake of its demise a rash of wars and plagues, following upon which the second coming of Christ would usher in the new millennium. Newton picked up the discarded many commencement dates until finally, toward the end of his life, he settled upon the year when the papal church had once and for all gathered up all temporal power. This date for the formal institution of the apostate imperial church, the beginning of the period of the Pope's supremacy, was AD 800. Quote, the year Charlemagne was crowned Emperor of Rome in the West by Pope Leo III, end quote. Adding 1260 years to 800 brings us to the year 2060, when, quote unquote, Babylon will fall. The apostate church will cease, and Christ will return to earth to set up a global 1,000-year kingdom of God. On page 144 of his Observations, 1733, Newton cited Daniel chapters 7, verses 26 and 27 as evidence. Quote, but the judgment shall sit, and they shall take away his dominion to consume and to destroy it until the end. And the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdom under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High, whose kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. End quote. The Halifax professor is quick to say that Newton did not believe the world would literally end in 2060. Rather, there will be a wholly new beginning. Quote, before the second coming, the Jews would return to Israel according to the predictions made in biblical prophecy, he says. The temple would be rebuilt as well. Slightly before or around the time of Christ's return, the great battle of Armageddon would take place when a series of nations, the Gog and Magog confederacy of Ezekiel's prophecy, invade Israel, end quote. Christ and the saints would then intervene to establish the worldwide 1,000-year kingdom of God. This would be a time of peace and prosperity. In the Observations, Newton quotes Micah chapter 4, verse 3, quote, the people will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. And nations shall not lift up a sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. End quote. One of the most compelling aspects of Newton's predicted date of 2060 is how far into the future, comparatively speaking, he sets the time for the end of the world. A tiny minority of prophetic exegetes around about Newton's time placed the end in the 21st century, but the trending was to place the end within or not long after one's lifetime. Joseph Medi, setting the commencement date at AD 476, the time of the fall of the Roman Empire, concluded that the end would come in 1736. William Lloyd, Bishop of Worcester, announced in person to Queen Anne in 1712 that Vatican City would be consumed by a flame of fire from heaven in the year 1716, and Newton's own prophetic disciple, William Whiston, set 1736 as the end of the 1260 years, and the year 1766 as the beginning of the millennium. Newton's mid-21st century date comes, of course, from his choosing as the commencement date the time when the Roman Catholic Church achieved total hegemony over worldly affairs, AD 800. But we may ask ourselves, did Newton know more? Did one of the greatest thinkers of all time, and the man who read more ancient works of arcane literature than anyone before or since, know something that no one else knew? Professor Sneblin wonders if Newton, who hated prophetic date setters, would be infuriated if he knew that the whole world now knows his date of 2060, or would he simply, quote, have been satisfied that now, as we are moving toward the age in which the true gospel is to be preached, It is time to preach openly, end quote. Concludes the Halifax professor, quote, we will have to wait until 2060 to ask him, end quote. And that is the end of that article. So the next one is on Gurdjieff. And before I jump into it, I am going to quickly take a break. My water is almost gone. And I have a feeling I'm going to be needing a lot of it to get through this next one. For some reason, my throat is, well, I went for a motorcycle ride. I probably breathed a bunch of dust today, so my throat's a little irritated. So I will be back in just a moment. We'll do that last article for this section of the book. See you in a few minutes. All right, back to continue on with this last article. And here we go. We're done with Newton for the time being, at least. I don't know if it'll bring him up again in the next section, but for this last article of the section, it's on Gurdjieff. So, the remarkable life of G.I. Gurdjieff. This is Article 33, by the way. Though his saga remains one of mystery, his influence is difficult to overstate. By John Chambers. Peter Brook's 1979 movie Meetings with Remarkable Men remains an admirable introduction to the life of the Russian seeker and teacher of esoteric truths G.I. Gurdjieff, 1866 with a question mark to 1949, who taught ascension to the fourth way of higher consciousness with methods that were brilliant, brutal, and wildly controversial. Gurdjieff was born in Alexandropol in Armenia. The movie, based on Gurdjieff's eponymous autobiography, was filmed in Afghanistan and opens with the scene of a rocky valley floor streaming with Transcaspian peoples who are about to witness an unusual music competition. The musicians, some playing extremely ancient instruments, compete to produce a sound that will evoke a response from the surrounding mountains, an echo perhaps, or a boulder tumbling down. It's finally the exotic exultation of a single human voice that draws an answering echo from the rocky peaks. The contest is over, but the life of Gurdjieff, who is seen here as a boy attending the competition, has only just begun to sing its exotic song of fourth way redemption to a struggling humanity. The boy returns to his house and an unusual relationship with his father, an Astrok, one of a vanishing breed of epic bards. As the film unfolds, we see the old man rouse his son with cold showers, slip snakes into his bed and hands, and impart strange knowledge to him. Gurdjieff asks, "Is there life after death?" The father replies, "Only for the few whose exceptional lives have created in them a certain substance that survives death." The old man's belief will become a source of the mature Gurdjieff's conviction that we must vigorously make our own souls to ensure a life in the afterworld. And of this belief in our making a concomitant substance, askakin, with which we feed the moon, quote unquote, feed the moon. Brooks' movie takes the young Gurdjieff through a series of encounters with the occult. A man rises zombie-like from the grave, a demon must be responsible, and a village elder cuts the dead man's throat. Placed in a trance by dervishes, a boy struggles unsuccessfully to break out of a magic circle drawn on the ground. Gurdjieff himself steps forward to yank the boy to safety. The future teacher slash guru witnesses quote-unquote table turning, sees simple potions cure lethal violent diseases. His appetite for the esoteric grows. Brooks's movie goes on to focus upon the burning desire of the adult Gurdjieff to discover the secret brotherhood of the Sarmong, said to possess primordial esoteric knowledge. Gurdjieff progresses through a succession of encounters with quote-unquote remarkable men. At the culmination of these meetings, we find Gurdjieff with a companion traveling blindfolded on horseback, guided by four Karakirgiz tribesmen across the rocky plains of Turkestan. Their destination is the secret monastery of the Brotherhood of the Sarmong. Arriving at the monastery after 12 days, Gurdjieff soon witnesses sacred dances that, preserved through the millennia, encode the motions of the planets and the basic forms of arcane knowledge in their movements. These dances, properly executed, serve to evoke this knowledge in the dancers' souls. Soon afterward, the young Gurdjieff, still at the secret monastery of the Sarmung Brotherhood, sadly bids farewell to his dearest friend, who is departing for the Himalayas and another monastery. On this note, Peter's book, Brooks's movie ends. Gurdjieff's life still had a long and spectacular way to go. After innumerable and unchronicled travels through the Middle and Far East in search of occult knowledge, the Armenian esotericist/adventurer returned to Russia and began the classes in sacred dance and the fourth way that P.D. Ouspensky describes so meticulously and brilliantly in Search of the Miraculous. The year was 1915. Soon, World War I and the Russian Revolution forced Gurdjieff to flee eastward under extraordinarily difficult circumstances with his tiny band of, sometimes eminent, students. The tattered crew of seekers crossed the Caucasus, settled briefly in Tiflis, Georgia, then went on to Constantinople, Berlin, and finally Paris. In 1922, Gurdjieff rented the Prieur de Basses Loges. I don't know. I know I butcher with French, but um, near Fontainebleau. Thus began in earnest Gurdjieff's immensely controversial and well documented Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man, which might have continued indefinitely had not a disastrous car accident in 1924 forced Gurdjieff to close it down. The weakened teacher then turned to writing. Meeting with Remarkable Men, the first of his 3 books, was not to be published until 1960. From 1934 until his death in 1949, Gurdjieff lived in Paris, continuing to receive and teach the occasional student. His work, of course, did not die with him. It continues today at various schools and countries. Gurdjieff's teachings and methodology, thought to come from the Sarmung Brotherhoods that the teacher plumbed in the early decades of his life, are not only actively taught today, but sound a subtle note in the cultural consciousness of our time as well. To grossly oversimplify, Gurdjieff taught that humanity dwells in 4 states of consciousness, with the vast majority occupying the first, a brutish, unaware, animal sleep. In the second, wakening consciousness, man is sporadically aware he is asleep. In the third, self-consciousness or self-remembering, man actively fights his way toward a higher awareness by attempting to align his 3 centers, the physical, the emotional, and the intellectual. The fourth state is the ascension to objective consciousness established in the fourth way. Gurdjieff's classroom techniques aimed at achieving objective consciousness often seem brutal. Certainly, there can no longer be any doubt that he was the progenitor of tough love. Gurdjieff believed that we are so frozen in our conditioning, our 3 centers are so hopelessly, mechanically, uncontrollably out of whack with one another, that we need to be shocked, surprised, and or practically abused in order to let go of their ordinary set configurations. In teaching the stop exercises, a student was required to stop dead no matter what he was doing. Thus, frustrated in following through with his normal conditioning, the student would be forced to cast about for new reactions. Voluntary suffering kept the student engaged in activities long past the time when he began to feel pain and would normally have stopped. Thus, he was forced to forge new, unprogrammed, and possibly promising connections between the 3 centers. Sacred movements and dances that introduced the student to new, or Gurdjieff would have said, ancient and forgotten, exacting physical and consequentially emotional and intellectual patterns of behavior further broke down ossification of old habits and opened the way for a renewed harmony between the centers. Before I go on, there is a picture of Gurdjieff. It is the only picture in the article, so we'll go ahead and show it. The incomparable G.I. Gurdjieff, whose teachings broke new ground in the field of consciousness studies. It's just a little tiny picture. But there you go. There was the man with his handlebar mustache and all. Okay. Kind of. Okay. Need to keep hydrating that throat. There are many other exercises. Over them all loomed Gurdjieff's magisterial concept of self-remembering. To attempt to describe it, albeit at great injustice, we must at every moment strive mightily not to let the body respond merely according to old and established patterns of behavior. We must continuously split our attention between the doing of a thing and the watching of the doing of the thing. In this way, we can monitor it, perhaps change it, and by never ceasing to maintain a distance between our objective consciousness and the actions that were carried out in its name, we might hope to escape the terror of the moment and take another step in the direction of the fourth way. The past decades have not seen a significant increase in the number of practitioners of the Gurdjieffian way, even in its heyday at the time of the Prairie. Critics were quick to point out that students didn't seem to change very quickly, and many seemed addicted to the work and to Gurdjieff himself. This has led not a few critics to conclude that the many exercises in self-remembering do not really conduce to a state of objective consciousness, or that objective consciousness, whatever it is, has little to do with the annihilation of the ego, nirvana, or the establishment in the self of Siddha Yoga, to describe this much desired state in somewhat more classical terms. The self-remembering of Gurdjieff, while also intended to underline the non-identity between the self and its actions, called for continuous attention to every one of an individual's worldly acts in such a way as to also continuously draw attention to the ego. The classical meditation of the yogi entailed rather continuous attention upon the higher self within. At a luncheon at the Prairie in the summer of 1926 or 27, Gurdjieff criticized in racial terms the celebrated essayist philosopher Waldo Frank's choice of a new wife. Frank never forgave the teacher of esotericism, and his comments in a much later work, Rediscovery, seem to many to accurately sum up the shortcomings of self-remembering. Admitting the necessity of unburdening ourselves of the barrier to truth that the ego constitutes, Frank nonetheless contended that, quote, the value axioms of the original method were never discussed. A method aimed at freeing the self from its ego center became an instrument for developing the ego. The I that observes the body and the world remains unchallengedly ego. End quote. Frank unabashedly associated Gurdjieff's power ego with that of Mussolini. Some wonder whether Gurdjieff's scandalous personal behavior entitled him to exact from his pupils the degree of personal loyalty and unthinking obedience that he did. In Gurdjieff, a Biography, James Moore quotes T.S. Matthews' turning of the witty phrase, quote, his women followers obviously adored him, and some who had found favor in his sight had visible mementos, swarthy and liquid-eyed children, end quote. But Paul Beacom Taylor, whose half-sister was Gurdjieff's illegitimate daughter, describes in Gurdjieff and Orage the sometimes cruel indifference with which the master treated a number of his mistresses and his illegitimate offspring. One mistress, who certainly wasn't cast out, was Jean de Salzmann, who became Gurdjieff's successor at the Paris Gurdjieff Foundation upon his death in 1949, holding that position till her own death in 1990, at the age of 101. De Salzmann bore Gurdjieff a son, Michel, in 1926. That son, swarthy and liquid-eyed, quote unquote, is now the head of the Paris Institute. Critics wonder whether Gurdjieff's many couplings with his sometimes married students really make him any different from Rajneesh, the notorious guru who, residing in the United States, regularly slept with his students and owned 99 Cadillacs. Gurdjieff, too, had a huge predilection for cars. Gurdjieffians reply that in effect, quote, what does a foible or two matter for somebody established in objective consciousness, end quote. But it may be a question not of morality, but of being, a word which Gurdjieff was fond and which holds a high place in his eschatology. Can the philanderer really be so completely separate from the teacher philosopher, especially in the case of a man like Gurdjieff, who considers himself to be established in objective consciousness and totally integrated? By integrated, we mean that he did not consider himself to be a collection of eyes like most of the human race, but a single eye. Will not one area seriously affect the other? In recent years, there have been renewed interest in Gurdjieff's bizarre 1,238-page novel, Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson, especially through the annual All and Everything International Humanities Conferences coordinated by Seymour B. Ginsburg of Miami and Chicago. These researches have suggested that the novel and its author also may have more complexly profound may be more complexly profound than was previously thought. Gurdjieff wrote the novel over many years, often freely employing the talents of his multilingual students. The deliberate obfuscation of its style, which he said, to prevent the reader from grasping its meaning too quickly, calling this stratagem burying the dog, masks what the old-time sci-fi pulp magazines called a space opera. However, it's a space opera with two astounding differences. The major character is Beelzebub, or Satan, and the book aims at being nothing less than an allegorical account of the whole history of mankind, from the birth of our planet to humankind's fall to its possible redemption. Still, even some mainstream scholars recognize that Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson falls into the great tradition of epic accounts of the fall of man, including Paradise Lost, the later poems of William Blake, e.g., The Four Zoas, and James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake. Asked why Gurdjieff's novel has to be quite so weird and impenetrable, Gurdjieffians reply that it's because Beelzebub's Tales is woven out of Gurdjieff's unique and comprehensive knowledge of ancient, esoteric, and lost learning. Asked why, if it's so innately difficult, then Gurdjieff had to go on and deliberately obfuscate the style. They say that this strategy is consonant with Gurdjieff's overall strategy of voluntary suffering. They quote the master's words about his early life. Quote, I wished to create around myself conditions in which a man could be continuously reminded of the sense and aim of his existence by an avoidable friction between his conscience and the automatic manifestations of his nature. End quote. Adds Cy Ginsberg, quote, Gurdjieff wanted the book to be read twice silently and a third time out loud. It's speculated that this reading aloud allows the content to bypass the intellect and impact the emotions much more powerfully. Crucial to this is the reading aloud of the 500 plus special words which Gurdjieff constructed from a wide variety of languages, which universal sounds presumably have an even vaster effect on the emotional center, end quote. Ginsberg, who writes extensively on Beelzebub's Tales, believes the book may be a recapitulation of the actual last 6 reincarnations of Gurdjieff. He also believes Gurdjieff may be the dancing master, quote-unquote dancing master, who Theosophical Society founder Helena Blavatsky predicted would be the great teacher of esotericism of the early 20th century. However strange G.I. Gurdjieff's intellectual doctrines may seem, however unpleasant his personal behavior and some of his teaching methods, there's little doubt that the thought and teaching techniques of this remarkable esotericist and first proponent of tough love continue to exert a subtle influence. Perhaps with the growing attention paid to Gurdjieff's Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson by groups such as the All and Everything conferences, and increasingly by universities, the influence may become considerably more than that. The end. And that is the last in this section, section 5. That puts us into section 6, the spirit and the soul. And the first article there is titled The Casting Out of Evil Spirits. So I have a feeling it's going to be an interesting ride through this last section. Now, as far as Gurdjieff, did I find Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson? I think I did. Let me do a quick something here. I think in my downloads, I think I found it and downloaded it. So, because it sounds very familiar. I know it's not just from reading it in here. Why is it showing me that? Okay, well, maybe not. Maybe I found it but didn't download it. Might have found it on archive.com or something. I don't know. I will look again for it. Gurdjieff. There we are. Okay, what I do have it. I do have it. I have a PDF of it. Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson. It is 1,135 pages. Yeah. Oh, I have multiple copies of it. How did I end up with multiple copies of it? I've got like 4 copies here. That one's only 563 pages. What the heck? Oh, it's just really small font. That's why. Okay. 876 pages. I'll have to do a comparison. This one's actually got a cover. 1,242 pages. Anyway, I'll figure out which one is the best, most readable copy of it, and maybe we'll add that into our reading list as well. Because why the hell not? That's what this reading stream is about. The Tuesday, Thursday, Sunday stream. I get to read what I want. I do ask for input. In fact, since we are getting into the last section of this book, and it'll be either 2 or 3 reading sessions to complete it, these all look fairly short until the very last. Like 4 of them there look really short. Anyway, I am thinking of a book by David Brian Davis, who, if you don't know who he is, he wrote some pretty interesting and I think controversial, if I remember correctly, books on slavery. Um, 2 of them that I have in hard copy that I'm looking at right now are The Problem of Slavery in the Age of Emancipation, and the other is The Problem of Slavery in Western Culture, which I think is the first book in all of them that he wrote on slavery. He's also got one in the Age of Revolution. I don't know. There's several of them, but I'm thinking of starting maybe The Problem of Slavery in Western Culture, or going completely off in another direction and reading something by Zecharia Sitchin, which would be The 12th Planet. I haven't read it. I haven't read the slavery one either. But those are the 2 books that I'm thinking of for the next one that we get into. Getting away from the Masons and that stuff for a while. Not that I'm sick of them. I love reading about the Masons and the Freemasons and the Templars and stuff. In fact, I fully intend to read the Book of Hiram, the Hiram Key, all of those, the Messianic Legacy. I have all of those. I intend to read them on this stream at some point, but I want to take a break from it and get into something else. So, yeah. Um, if anybody's got a preference on one of those 2 uh, books, let me know. Otherwise, pretty soon I will put a poll out on Twitter, because I can leave it up for 7 days, so I get a lot more traction with it, a lot more attention. So than the 10-minute poll I can do on Twitch. So anyway, that's it. We're done. I don't think I'm going to game tonight. So yeah, I'll see you all tomorrow night for Star Wars reading and maybe some gaming. Actually, let's see who's around, if anyone, to raid. Know what I mean? Got to raid if we can raid. We've got Mikachu, Dead by Daylight, Wolf and Narwhal, Legend of Zelda, Tofugo playing Fortnite, Nathaniel Games, Killer Frequency. How about Wolf and Narwhal? We'll go over and raid them real quick. We're only taking 2 people with us, but hey, why not? I got no problem with 2 or 3 viewers, and they don't either. They like any raid they can get. So I will see you all over there.